Hello and welcome. This is the presentation for Module 5 of the HyFlex Learning Community's HyFlex Course Design Workshop. And in this module, this presentation is talking about explaining and evaluating your HyFlex approach, your HyFlex course, your program, however large or small you may see this happening. It's important to first be able to explain it to other people. It could be colleagues, it could be advisors, it could be supervisors, it could be student communities, other kinds of communities that are interested in knowing why the students are being given some choice and how you're doing multiple modes. What's that like? And also it's important to be able to evaluate your approach to see how well it's working. Is it meeting your outcomes? Are learning outcomes being met? Are students satisfied? Are faculty satisfied? Is everything working well? Or are there some things that could be changed? This is all an important part of implementing HyFlex with a full circle look at what do we want to do? Why are we going to do it? How do we design for it? How do we put it into practice? And then how do we realize the truth about how well it's working? So let's talk about that for a few minutes. All right, I'm going to once again share the presentation that is available to you in Module 5 of the workshop in a Session 5 presentation about evaluating HyFlex impact. So we're going to talk a little bit about the effectiveness of HyFlex courses and what we know so far. We've been doing research on this for well over 10 years, and we've got good, I think, reasonable and believable findings around participation, overall learning, student satisfaction. There are lots of other areas of research that have been looked at as well. But really what it comes down to is understanding what matters for you. Personally, as a professional, as a designer, a teacher, a facilitator, whichever role you have, what would you want to know to make sure that this wonderful plan you have for doing things differently for your students, the students of your institution, those you wish to serve with high quality courses and learning experiences in multiple modes, how well is it working? Your institution may have other things it's looking for too. Are you reaching the institutional goals and the outcomes that you're expecting for the overall purpose? Remember, we are looking for designs, and we're trying to implement designs that create a single learning community, a single course, but they have multiple participation modes. Some learners might be in person, some learners would be online, and then when they're online, they might be asynchronous, or in some cases, they may be synchronous. So you've already made some decisions about that. So one of the things you might want to evaluate is to whether or not students are actually taking advantage of those opportunities to participate in different ways. How would you explain that to someone? So this idea of explanation and evaluation in some ways kind of go hand in hand. You have to be able to understand what you're doing and then how well it's actually working. So when we think about the HyFlex principles, these are our core principles we've been talking about in each of the presentations, in each of the modules. You've been exploring this. Are there any of these that you particularly want to evaluate? Do you want to see if the students are actually taking advantage of the alternatives? Would you like to see if there's equivalent learning happening in the various modes available in your class, different participation paths that are available? Would you like to evaluate how well things are being reused? How many online students are actually accessing the materials that we're creating in the live sessions? How many students who participate in the live sessions are actually taking advantage of the materials that are also being created in the online spaces as well? And is it accessible? Would you want to do an accessibility review? Sometimes that's an important part of course design and course evaluation, especially for online courses. So when we think about this, there are some places that we've already looked at the impact, and we've got pretty good answers to questions like, okay, so what difference does this make? Here are some that we've looked at before and looked at in different places. You can find a lot of studies, well, some studies, at least 13 studies highlighted in this book chapter that's highlighted at the bottom of the page here. We look at the impact of our HyFlex implementations. There are also studies in the HyFlex Learning Community's bibliography page, and we'll take a quick look at those in a little bit. There's almost 300 studies that are actually linked through there. linked, at least referenced. Many of them have links with keywords, etc. So when we look at student participation patterns, this is something I looked at pretty early. I wanted to make sure that I was offering different modes that students would actually find useful. Because I was doing this because I thought students needed to have some flexible paths, some different paths. And I couldn't dictate on a week-to-week basis who needed to be in person, who needed to be online. And so I wanted to see what would happen. And so I checked the participation by mode. And in the early days of HyFlex, this is data over about roughly 3 to 4 years in one particular class, and then adding in some data from another class, but all students in the same program, essentially the same kinds of students, very similar characteristics. And I found that 60% of them would typically be in person. About 30% of them would be participating online. In these days, it was primarily online, asynchronous. And to my surprise, I still found that I had about 10% of my students choosing not to be part of any mode, even though they had choices. Here I was thinking, oh, if you can't be here in person, you could just do it online. Certainly made it available to students, but they didn't all take advantage of that. So what I began to realize that sometimes when students aren't participating because they're busy, maybe their work has got them somewhere other place, or family requirements are such as they are, or for some reason their life is just super busy, or who knows, maybe they're on vacation. Sometimes they're also not available to be there online. Just because a path's available to them doesn't necessarily mean they have the time or that they will make the choice to be part of it. But in general, this is what I found. I still had a lot of students coming from a face-to-face program, teaching HyFlex courses inside of a face-to-face program, inside of a university that was primarily face-to-face instruction, like 80 to 85% of it at least. Most of the students were still in person. Okay, that was pre-pandemic. Another thing I looked for around participation is how much did they, one, choose their modes at the beginning of the semester and never change, or did they change from time to time? This is from this 3 or 4 year period you see highlighted here. What we found is that there was about 10 or 15% of change every week on average for students in these classes. We called that percent of flex, percent churn. You could call it loss. So what that told me and told us in the early days was, yeah, they were finding some value here, and they were making some different choices from week to week, depending upon their individual requirements, their individual contexts. So HyFlex was something that they were expressing value in by the way they were participating. We also saw that when we listed two sections of the same course, before we had our administrative system set up to list a HyFlex section, we would often have a class section. If we had two sections of a particular course, we would list one as online, we'd list one as face-to-face, and then we would invite students to be either mode they wanted to within those sections, within those class shells, and we would combine those. So it essentially became into one double-sized class. Yeah, we never had more than the regular size in the classroom at any particular time, and we would typically have about a regular size classroom online. And this just shows the percentage of participation in those. We found that students were more likely to stay in the course section type that they signed up for, which isn't surprising. If I'm looking for an online course, I'll enroll in one. If I'm looking for a face-to-face course, I'll typically want to enroll in that. So if I have the option to go online, even though I enrolled in a face-to-face course, I might take that some of the time, but I'll probably for the most part take the face-to-face option, because that's what I originally signed up for. That must have been what I was looking for. At least that's the thought. Now, we also taught some HyFlex in the early days in very large class sections. This is data essentially from a 1,200 person course. What we did is we took roughly 30 or 40 sections of a smaller class and put them together and created one Uber class, very large. So 1,200 students. And so there was one lecture that people could go to. I think it was twice a week. And we put it into a classroom or a lecture hall it was like 200 people, maybe slightly less. But we knew that based on our expectations and what we found in the data after our first few times running this, was that most of those students 80 to 90% of them would do it online. And they might watch a live stream. They'll probably watch an archive view or a recording view. And then about 5% would be in class. And so even though we had 100, I think it was like a 170 classroom, which means HyFlex will support a very large section too, not just smaller sections. They're active, engaging. So one other thing we looked at was we did some surveys with students. Are students satisfied? Well, and I did a couple of surveys, and there's our links in the modules, or module 5, essentially. I found that about 80%, 79% either agreed or strongly agreed with the statement, hey, I learned as much as I expected. And that was really, really important to me. I wanted to make sure that most, if not all students were going to report that, yeah, I learned as much as I expected. Some of them disagreed or strongly disagreed, right? I learned as much as I expected. I disagree. 12% were undecided. About 9% either disagreed or strongly disagreed. And what that means to me is that they probably did not have a wonderful experience in the mode they were in. Most likely, and we would get this in some of the comments, it was in the asynchronous path when they found that it wasn't very interactive, or there weren't very many students online interact in the asynchronous path. And in those days, I didn't require all my students to be part of the online asynchronous discussions if they were in the live session. If they were in the live session, they were done with discussion from my perspective. And so we might have an online discussion of 3 students, 6 students, 7 or 8 students. And so it probably wasn't very rich in that situation. So not very many did not learn what they expected, but some of them did not. You know, unfortunately, that's true. And if you ask any class, any single mode, you may have similar data. You just explain it differently. I also asked them about who should choose this blend? Who should make this decision about how you're participating? I thought this would be 95 to 100%. I prefer to choose the blend. I mean, that's what we're doing here, right? We have flexibility as a key value, alternatives and learner choice. But we found that only 86% of the students agreed or strongly agreed with the statement, I prefer to choose the blend. 14% disagreed. They did not prefer to choose the blend. So what do we do about that? Well, my hope is that students who don't want to choose a blend will just pick a path at the very beginning, whatever their preferred path is, whatever their context allows, and they would stick to that path throughout the class. So if I want to be there in person, I'll find a way to be there in person, and I'll be there every week. Or if I don't want to be in person or I can't be in person, well, I'm just going to resign myself or choose enthusiastically to be that face-to-face person or that online person every week. There are some research summaries, as I said, that are posted in the library or in the book, in the chapter 2.5. And so these might be very interesting for you to take a look through. We'll look at the highlights of a few of them here. So one of the things that I call out in the book, and I've talked about before in different places, is that I was looking for terms more than just HyFlex, because HyFlex was our term. And yet the research was including and reporting on other terms used for essentially the same thing: mode neutral, multi-options, multi-access learning, flexible hybrid, blend flex, flex learning, Pierce fit, converged learning, co-modal, flexibly accessible learning environments. All of these are essentially HyFlex, but they have a different name. And it's rightly so. Everyone has an opportunity to name their approach their own. It's nice if they, take a look and see what's in the literature, what's already published around different approaches, and maybe there's some convergence around the name, but why not brand it for your own environment, for your marketing purposes? There are other places, synchronous learning and distributed learning environments, remote live participation, BlendSync, and GX Learning, which were also multiple options, but not necessarily giving flexible, or at least emphasizing the flexibility for students. So all of these might be part of the literature that we can draw from to learn from each other around HyFlex. So what I'll do is I'll pause a little bit at each one of these. This was the first one that that I had in any kind of published area. It was a proceedings of a paper that was delivered at a conference in 2007. And this is where I talked about the participation patterns. I said, if you build it, how will they come? So what do students actually do when they show up? Participation patterns and how well they were learning and how they were satisfied. You can take a look at that. That's available online. Another study, this is from 2012, was around institutional change in an Australian university. This institution decided to go largely towards what they call converged learning. I don't think they're doing this anymore. I think they switched back after a period of time, either because they realized they didn't need it, or maybe there was pushback from one of their major communities, either student communities. I think it was having to do with the student communities, but you can take a look at that. But they do talk really interesting in the study about how they actually decided to do this change overall. And I don't know if they went back to during the pandemic and did more online. I'm not sure. One of the questions I also get was, Dr. Beatty, you teach graduate courses in education. Can this work in undergraduate courses? Can this work with something like statistics? And of course, the answer is yes. Jack Miller and associates have been doing this at different institutions, Michigan, Ohio State, and is now, I think, out in California, teaching and doing this with very large undergraduate statistics courses, and finding that the students are satisfied and the learning is no different in the students who are participating in different modes. So yeah, STEM classes can be taught this way as well. Okay, this study is this is 2014. All right, this one is looking at undergraduate, very large courses, 439 students. And they were looking at the different kinds of participation that students had to do, the things that were counting towards their learning, the exams, the homework assignments, multiple choice tests and quizzes and things like that. And they found that when students were more engaged with a continuous assessment, like the homework assignments, then it made a difference, the modes. What they found is that if there was a mode where students could be less engaged with homework, not doing the continuous assessment or the homework assignments very well, then that was a weak mode for learning for those particular students, not surprisingly. So design matters. Can you do this in engineering? I was an engineering student many years ago, and I'd say, yes, you certainly can. Now, there may be some practical hands-on things you need to do in a lab environment for many classes, STEM classes and other kinds of things, medical sciences, et cetera. But sometimes you can do those online simulated, or sometimes you can create a hybrid approach where it's HyFlex for lectures and it's more hybrid or face-to-face for lab environments, those kinds of things. So this is another one that was writing about, hey, if the students are engaged in the learning process, right, especially the online students who are probably our biggest concerns of being engagement, for example, then they can learn just as well as anyone else. There's another study. This one was looking at communication. And so this was done, and they used a term called cross-mediatic. In other words, if you have multiple different ways, different media of your communications for students, what does that matter to them? The reason I highlighted this is because there's 90 pages of interview transcripts included in this master's thesis. And so if you want to see what students are actually saying, or hear what they're actually saying, or read what they actually said, you can look at a study like this and get a lot of insight into some of the things that they talk about that students think are important. So that's another one you might want to look at. Let's see. This one is looking at closing the gap between classroom and remote or online students. And so here we were looking at a course where it was offered in multiple modes, face-to-face classes and online classes. And they found the students in the online classes were not learning as well based on grades compared to the face-to-face students. And so when they made a HyFlex version of this, they found that those participating in the online path were doing just as well as the students in the face-to-face path, and all of them were doing just as well as the students in the face-to-face only course. So essentially, they improved the performance for the online students, so that became a richer environment for them. They were able to learn better, and they did not degrade the experience for the face-to-face students. This is an important finding, I believe. Another good one to take a look at. This one focused on the blended synchronous delivery mode. And it talked about different kinds of presence. And so they were looking at the various design factors that made this work. And so you can take a look at this. One of the reasons I highlight this one, and there's at least another one in here, these are dissertations, which means there's a very rich literature review that you can kind of mine through to see what these researchers were finding as they were doing their studies, a number of years ago in HyFlex, and it continues today. Every year, there's a couple of more dissertations that are done that are specifically looking at HyFlex courses or HyFlex programs and various aspects of student experience. We've pretty much gotten beyond the need for more studies that say, how did you do this? Although that's an important part of everybody's study when they're looking at how well did this work, because you have to explain what exactly did you do, in part because there's some variety and it's very context driven sometimes what we actually do. But the questions about can this work in pretty much any discipline are almost not even being asked anymore. We know that there are some disciplines where it works for some of the time, it doesn't work other parts of the time. We know that for the mass majority of the courses we teach, you probably could teach this way. It's just a matter of whether you choose to do so and if you've got the ability to prepare well for it. There's another different dissertation, this is 2015, and this one was looking at the experiences of first-generation students and how much the concept of being student ready impacted their experience. And what they found is that for the students who were in their first year courses, and some of them were taking HyFlex courses, the difference in their student readiness kind of washed out as a factor influencing the success of first generation students compared to non-first generation students. So the fact that they may not have been as well prepared for regular college didn't matter as much in a HyFlex course as it did in a face-to-face or an online mode course. So this is an important finding as well. And what it means is that you might have more robust learning in a richer learning environment in a HyFlex course, so it can actually be a better experience for students than at either mode, perhaps. This one was looking at student equity and engagement. So when we have studies looking at student equity, we have to dig into them a little bit. Well, what do you mean by equity? Do you mean grade equity? Do you mean the experience of equity from a traditional kind of social justice equity perspective? Right. So what we're looking here, this one is looking primarily at student learning equity. So they found that these courses were effective in achieving goals of student equity, in other words, equivalent learning and engagement defined by the authors, reported by students. So surveys are used in a lot of these studies. Here's another study we have, which is really interesting. It's got 300 some students enrolled at a Canadian university. They use the term comodal, and I brought this one in here because it introduces another term and explains why they're using this term comodal. And this shows, I mean, in their study, this was once again a few years ago, students favored the remote or the online mode over the face-to-face mode. 60% of them never attended class in person. So these numbers were different than mine. They were more shifted towards online, and there may be various reasons for that. But that would be one thing to look at. What do students choose, and why do they choose it, especially if in your case it's different? If I did a study like this now, I'd have numbers that are even stronger towards online than the ones reported here pre-pandemic. 28% of students in their study changed participation from week to week. Overall, total number. In my classes, it was probably more like 40 to 50% of students who at least once a semester, although any particular week, it was only about 10 or 15% of the students, as I mentioned earlier. This is another study. This is about a master teacher program. right? And so it's a literature review. So that's an important part. I like literature reviews because it helps me find other studies to look at because they can all tell me something interesting. So I include this one here because I appreciate the fact that people are doing real literature reviews, which means there's enough literature to review. And even these days, there's even more and more research that can be done on this. Another literature review is highlighted in this particular article. So this is another one that can be very helpful for us. So these are there for you to review. They're all there in the literature. You're free access for them, probably through your library system. Some of them are online free access anyway. This is another study. This is by David Rhodes, who's actually an advisor in the HyFlex learning community, did a dissertation, and he looked at a lot of interesting things. His institution decided to go towards HyFlex because they couldn't afford, like our institutions couldn't either afford a face-to-face version of a class as well as an online version of a class. And they knew they had a market for their program in both of those areas. So they combined the classes. They did some other course redesign as well, but they also talked about some of the cost savings they had when they didn't have to have a half full online section and a half full face-to-face section. They could instead have a full HyFlex section. So they were able to meet some important organizational goals. Well, as I mentioned, that there's also the HyFlex learning bibliography that you can take a look at. I'll just show it on the screen here shortly. So here we have between 250 and 300 entries. This is what is it? We're in early 2024 here. And I continue to add to this, or our community continues to add to this. About every 3 or 4 months, we go through and add another 10 or 20, whatever we find in the literature that's published that we can get to. And every one of these studies is connected to hybrid flexible course design, oftentimes using the term HyFlex, but not always. And so we do this by year, so you can look at it from the age. And it's not a very easy search, but you can search. So, for example, if you did a search for dissertations, you can just use your web browser search, and you'll see 1 there, 2 there, 3 there, 4 there. There's got to be at least 7 or 8 of them here, going back to 2022, a couple of 2022, 3 or 4. All right, 2021, 2020, 2019, 2018, et cetera, all the way back to 2015. So you can see that there's a lot of different things here you can search through. You can find some useful. I started doing this, and part of this is actually in the book up until about 2019. Everything else that's been added is here at the HyFlex Learning Community site. And just to show you where that is real quickly, it's on the website for the HyFlex Learning Community. It's in the services area. Well, it's actually in the resources area, and it's called the research bibliography. So if you're interested in more of this, take a look there. You can also just go to your favorite database search tool for your library system and search, and you'll find a lot of things there. So the real question, though, for you, I guess, or an important question, not the only question, is what should you measure? What would you want to know? What do you value? Did you find something in this list that was valuable to you? Would you want to see whether or not it actually is playing out the way you hoped it would in your particular context? Could be around the students, could be around the faculty, could be around the courses. Are you getting the enrollment you expected? Are you getting access to students? Are you giving access to students who couldn't have access before? You might ask them about that. You might do some looking. You can look into your data and see if students are still coming from the same places. Are students able to support busier schedules, different schedules? Are they able to be in your programs when before it would have been very difficult for them to be? Does it matter to the students that they can make the choice? Does it improve somehow their experience as a learner because they now have more agency? Are they satisfied with the learning experience? Are they satisfied with the participation experience as well? Are you trying to save space on campus or use your space more efficiently? That's certainly a goal of many of our institutions. Right. So is that working out how you think? Sometimes if you're going to do this, if you want campus space savings, you probably have to do more than a single course or 2 of HyFlex. But you don't necessarily have to have a whole number of courses. If a particular program is often using the same spaces, you might be able to find some space savings even with just, a handful of courses in the same program. What about faculty adoption? Do you care about faculty making a choice to teach HyFlex? Do they have a choice? Or faculty are being told that we're going to move in this direction? How does that being received? Do they feel like they're being prepared? Those are all areas of research you could ask because believe me, it's been asked. And in many times it's been written about. Not always, I have to say, but many times. Sometimes people will do research and just keep it internal. What are the other questions you might have to answer? You know, participation kinds of questions, quality questions, satisfaction questions. Or you could look into it more deeply around the actual learning experience, the granular learning experience. So think about the data you have available. You have administrative data, you have student data, you have faculty data, right? You have cost data, perhaps, if you keep track of this. You have student participation data, their enrollment. You might even, we sometimes look at the rate of student enrollment in a class coming up in the next term and use that to determine the popularity. Students are expressing their popularity by filling particular classes in particular sections before they will others. Like oftentimes our online sections, fully online, might fill before the face-to-face sections. With a HyFlex section, especially if students know what it is, will that fill before anyone else? I can tell you a little bit about whether or not they're interested in that kind of learning environment. Student retention, faculty retention, all these things might be something to look at. So think about the data that's available to you, and then think if you have to answer questions and the data is not available to you, all right, how are you going to get the data? You might have to generate the data, right? If you want to generate the data, are you going to ask questions in surveys? Are you going to do interviews? Are you going to do informal, looking around? If you're not going to write about something, you might be able to gather data like from a course. I do reflections every week in all my courses. That's a rich set of data there that talks about the student experience. All I'd have to do is kind of write that up in a way that can help me and my institution understand what's going on in these classes. If I wanted to do it more publicly, of course, then I would go through our institutional review board and get permission to use that data. And students would have to opt into that, of course. So other kinds of student data you might have available too. This is just a short list here, right? But you might look at, well, how much are they using the tutoring services, the advising services? Various questions like that could also be important ones for you to answer. What kind of data do you have in your learning management system? We've changed learning management systems, and so our data set has changed a little bit, but still we get basic data. But if you're going to do a particular study around the use of the learning management support students in various modes, you might be able to take the data that's already generated and package it differently so you can ask and answer different questions. How about faculty data? Are they taking advantage of professional development? Are they participating in teaching? Are they satisfied with it? Are they talking to others in their program about it? Are they writing about it in their field? Sometimes it's very important for them. So what's available to you? How will you generate additional data around the faculty? Once you have data, you can figure out how well your HyFlex solution is working. If you create it as a bridge, we were created initially as a bridge to online. We decided that we were going to live on that bridge though. So we created HyFlex, and we created essentially a HyFlex program with some online options and lots of face-to-face options. We decided we weren't going to cross that bridge until it was right. And then at some point we did cross the bridge, but we didn't completely give up on the face-to-face. So now we have a fully online program that has some HyFlex courses. So students in those courses at least can have the face-to-face experience if they choose it. I like the metaphor of a bridge though. We are connecting students to learning. We're connecting online and face-to-face environments. And so we're also in some ways connecting the way we used to teach to the way we're teaching now, kind of looking towards the future. What are the changes that you're going to have to require? I don't know, but you can figure that out. There is another worksheet for you in the workshop module 5, as well as in the book. It talks about assessing the return on expectations. You can call it ROI if you want. It's probably more like a return on expectations. So what are your expectations? Why would you do this in the first place? Or why have you chosen to do this? What value did you expect to receive? How are you planning on measuring it? How could you measure it? What kind of analysis would you need to do for that data? And then overall, then after you've done this, well, what is the evaluation? What was the value returned? You have happier students, more satisfied customers, more students in your courses. It's up to you to decide what's important to you and then to write about it. If you do have that opportunity, please share it with the community. Some of the common problems that come up, you might want to think about how would you solve these. This is part of evaluating, is not necessarily just for research, right? Sometimes it's just like, we want to make sure this is working well. But if students don't know about HyFlex, how would you solve that problem? probably a communication challenge. Students don't engage in online activities, especially discussions. Well, how do you solve that? Maybe motivating them with some, rewards. Students often work for points. Young students work for points. Old students work for points. Modeling, facilitation, all that stuff matters. Student learning online is weak. We saw a lot of this during the pandemic. They're falling behind, perhaps. Well, maybe it's time management. Maybe it's motivation. Maybe it's some other things that we can do to change our design that would help us get these students learning on a real regular basis. If we've got bad audio or video, we've struggled through that before in different places. We essentially need audiovisual resources and some skilled tech people to actually put it into place and make it work for us. Faculty don't have the time to build an online course path. Yeah. Or maintain it or work with it. Well, sometimes this is skill. Sometimes it's a bit of startup resources for them or designer support. So you'll have local solutions for that. Whatever you would use to help them prepare to teach a fully online class are probably the resources you should be expending to help them teach a fully face-to-face or HyFlex course, excuse me. All right, you can find out more about this all, of course, at edtechbooks.org and the HyFlex at the book. They're continuously we're continuously adding chapters to the case studies section of that. And of course, the HyFlex learning community will be there to support you as well. If you have questions, don't hesitate to ask me through the workshop module. All right.